Okay, so this is Flaminia Fortunato. Some of you might already know me, some might not. And I'm currently working at the Brooklyn Museum. However, prior to the Brooklyn Museum, I was at MoMA as a media conservation fellow. And so my third year of fellowship is now at the Brooklyn Museum. So what I'm gonna share today is the outcome of a research that I conducted previously last year. And that my partner in crime, Joy Heinen, who is here as well, presented previously. And Joy, do you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Sure. Good morning. I'm Joey Heinen. I'm coming to you from Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Museum of Art. So yes, as Flaminia mentioned, this was part of some shared research we did related to respective acquisitions of iOS-based artworks.
So these that we're going to present today is basically the outcome of a year of cross-institutional collaboration. So we are very delighted to be here. Oops, sorry. And we would like to share a little bit the process, the findings, unanswered questions that came about when we were developing this project. And we are also very interested in a dialogue today because we found that having weekly meeting among each other was actually building a lot of confidence in what we were doing. And we hope that as a team and as a field, we can continue upon these footsteps that we did in the past. So in the past several years, the emergence of apps on the market has been spreading at a fast pace and populating digital shelves with these incredible tools that have the power to enhance or complicate our daily lives. And as these mediums reach a critical mass, they became also available for artists and triggered a lot of curiosity and enthusiasm to experiment with this medium as a creative medium. And so those shown here are a few examples of apps that have been created and were shown in different exhibition settings. And either commissioned, as the case of Savannah, which is first year, and then others that were acquired by different institutions. And obviously they differ in the way they were made, in the way they were shown. And this proliferation of apps and the way they were starting to be acquired in museum collection is actually the seed from which our research stems. And the initial question that we start unraveling together was, were the following: what does it mean to collect mobile iOS app-based works? What does it mean to collect iOS augmented reality app-based works? And where do the two acquisition meet in similarities, and where do they differ? What is even the object of preservation when we acquire this work? Is it the experience? Is it the software component? Is it the mobile? Is it the immersiveness? So all these questions came at the very beginning of our research. And then which tools and methods can we inherit from the preservation of software-based works that can be applied for the preservation of these objects and artworks? Because obviously there is a software component in all of them, but there are also differences. So we were trying to utilize and get inspired from a huge work that has been done in the community for software-based artworks preservation, and trying to understand how we can use these tools for the purpose of iOS-based apps. And then what can we learn from the challenges in preserving this work to actually enhance and inform future collaboration, education opportunities, and perhaps our advocacy. So this is this presentation will be focusing on two case studies: composition from Marimba by Mungo Thompson, which was acquired by LACMA, and it was a gift by John Baldessari. Joy will talk better about it later. And then WYDRN, which is a augmented reality iOS-based app made by Martin Sims in collaboration with Brent Freeney. So just quickly here, an overview of the different teams. Joy, do you want to introduce your team?
Sure. So at LACMA, we have kind of split the work of preservation of our time-based media collection across 3 roles. So there's myself. I am responsible for the long-term preservation of our digital artworks. Morgan Kessler manages the incoming acquisitions of all media artworks, but is specifically focused on AV or kind of analog media, and Abby Ducker, who's our objects conservator, who specializes in electronic media, does specific work around dedicated electrical components, display devices, and things of that nature.
And this is the MoMA team. So it is a team of 3 people and stuff. There are some photos that are not here yet. But we have Kate Lewis, who is the chief conservator and media conservator as well. Peter Alexis is associate media conservator. Amy is assistant media conservator. And then there are 3 fellows, Caroline Hill, Leah Kramer, who is here in the audience, and myself. Okay, and I'll pass over to Joy.
Thank you. Yes, so you know, while we initially did this research around iOS apps in general, obviously today we're focused on specific aspects of apps, namely immersive qualities, AR, VR. But I think it'll be important to highlight just generally how iOS apps are developed. And as Savannah alluded to, there are some particular complexities when it comes to Apple-based systems. So I'll be kind of giving a brief overview of that. So there are basically 3 types of apps that can be delivered: native, web, and hybrid. And so native being built for a specific OS platform, web being those that can be activated through a browser, and then hybrid that is a mixture of those. And for this case, we're dealing with mostly kind of native apps, so there are some kind of hybrid qualities. So just to kind of highlight that that's what we're focused on with these case studies. Please, next slide. And so the basic components of an iOS app involve mainly Xcode as the platform for writing and compiling the code to a device or to the App Store. From there, you select a specific programming language. At least at the time of our research, this was the case where it was either between Swift programming language or Objective-C. But regardless of how you're building your dev environment, you also have to be considerate of the destination platform and what those devices are capable of. So whether they have specific camera angles, screen dimensions, haptic qualities, those are all things that have to be thought about when development so that the platform they're written to can actually enable those functions. Next slide, please. And just to give you a brief view of the developer environment within Xcode. So as you can see, it's not necessarily as free-form as you know, most code writing environments. Everything is pretty predetermined. There's drop-downs, there's specific windows and views for compiling things, for drawing connections with media assets. So everything is nicely kind of laid out for you. However, in a way, as Apple is prone to do, a lot of the actual kind of mechanics of the underlying code are not made immediately available to you. It's all kind of obscured, and there's sort of an abstraction layer to all of that. So that's another kind of consideration, is really understanding what's actually happening to the code, or how much of it is Xcode kind of applying some of its own specific behaviors on top of the code that you're writing. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, apps can be deployed in a couple different ways, at least for the iOS environment. So ad hoc or sideloaded is ones that are directly written or signed to a device. And app stores is once it is uploaded to the store for multiple devices to sign on to them. But in both cases, a developer license is required, and this was something that was not completely understood when this work was acquired, that maintenance of an iOS app was going to require access to that developer account, because this is a yearly license that must be constantly upkept, and that the device that's running that also has to be tapped into that license. Next slide, please. So now we'll actually dive into the specific case studies and questions now that I've kind of given you a broad overview of the iOS app development environment. Next slide. So LACMA acquired Mungo Thompson's composition from marimba back in 2016. This is a work that is in effect a sculptural work that performs a chance-operated software-based work, which is a sequence of playing cards with accompanying marimba tones. It is a randomized sequence, so it's not a video file. It's actually a dynamically generated sequence, and the cards do have a direct correlation to a certain tone within the scale of a marimba. And so this plays through wireless speakers in the space that are sent through the AirPlay feature on iPhones. Next slide, please.
Do you want to play the video?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay.
So next I'll give you a view of our deliverables, which later kind of led to some strife as we were actually assessing this, given that at the time of acquisition in 2016, we didn't have any dedicated collections staff for reviewing the technical aspects of these works. So next slide, please. So in 2016, when we acquired this work, it was actually following an exhibition that featured this work. And so when we purchased the work, the artist simply delivered what they had. We received the iPhone that was used in the exhibition, which had the app preloaded onto it. And then we received the Xcode project files, which, as you can see, is a kind of nested directory of the Xcode project itself, but then all these underlying dependencies, plist files, which effectively kind of help in locating the different media assets that are nested in other folders, such as the audio files and the image files for the playing cards. Those all have to reside in a separate part of the directory, such that when an app is being compiled and written to a device, it's pulling all of those assets together and assigning it to the IPA format, which is what is being run on this side-loaded version of the app. Next slide, please. So, needless to say, we discovered a few years down the road, when it occurred to us that this work had been acquired slightly out of procedure, that we should probably take a look at it and see if there are any issues that had come up within those past couple of years. And naturally, there were some issues. So initially, we fired up the phone and we decided to try to launch the app. And what would result is an initial kind of activation before it would just ultimately crash and not give us any indication as to why. We had been told by the artist at the time of acquisition not to update the iOS version, which of course, is a no-brainer. But we were instantly greeted with a gentle reminder to please update that iOS version, which of course we did not want to do. But then we noticed that the phone automatic updates had not been turned off. So our immediate concern was that perhaps the iOS version had already updated itself, or other dependencies on the phone had done so. So this was our first suspicion, but we had to explore this further to confirm that. Next slide, please. And so initially we decided to do an iPhone backup through the iTunes mechanism, which creates a mobile sync backup. But we quickly learned that this is not how we understand typical disk images to function. They're obviously through proprietary Apple systems that only give you a snapshot of what you actually need. There are all sorts of hidden files that you have to be very aware of in order to do a complete assessment of everything. But even then, once you're able to access those files, they're all encrypted. They're all within their own alphanumeric codes, and the actual information is not very apparent to you. You would actually need Apple tools to unencrypt and interpret that information to know when updates had happened, if that was the issue, what other things might have been loaded onto the phone. This was all information that we really needed, but was not available to us based on the tools available. Next slide, please. And in opening up the Xcode project and attempting to sign it to the device with the version of Xcode that was on the computer, we were instantly greeted with a message that said we needed to update the underlying code Swift from version 2 to version 3, but that was not going to be possible in this version of Xcode. So we knew that we were going to have to go back to a previous version in order to migrate that to a more updated version if our suspicion was correct that the iOS had been updated, in which case we wanted to observe if migration of Swift 2 to Swift 3 was going to reveal any obvious differences. Next slide, please. So as stated, we first tried it on a computer that had version 9.4 on it, but it could not complete this migration from 2 to 3. So that was a failure. We next tried to use it on a second version of Xcode that was installed on that same machine, so version 8.21. However, we then noticed that when installing Xcode onto a machine, it builds these underlying dependencies, specifically the Swift programming language. So even though we had this version 8.2, it was still pointing to version 9.4's underlying Swift dependency. So it was still not able to perform that migration. So then on a second machine, we happened to have a version of Xcode that was near the version of the original Xcode project that we had. So then we were able to migrate from Swift 2 to Swift 3, fortunately. Next slide, please. Of course, we wanted to also get an underlying understanding of what was actually happening with the work by looking at the source code, but also having an interview with the artist. And we were interested in a few specific aspects, such as the timing of the work, if the cards and the sounds were supposed to appear to the viewer in a certain duration or with certain rapidity. We then also wanted to explore the nature of the randomizer, like how random was it, or was it simply repeating certain sequences every certain number of times? We wanted to know how important was the display, which we learned was very significant, as the version that was used for the work, an iPhone 6, has specific screen dimensions that are quite similar to a standard deck of playing cards. So it was important to the artist that that aspect ratio have a one-to-one relationship to the physical object of a deck of playing cards. And then for audio purposes, it was mostly important that the sound play wirelessly, so as to cut down on unnecessary cables and cords. And while Bluetooth was explored, it was found that there was a slight lag in time, so they went with the AirPlay app. So if we were to substitute AirPlay for another wireless audio device, we would have to bear in mind a delay or kind of correspondence between the sounds and how they're actually appearing with the playing cards. So that dialogue was extremely helpful should we need to rebuild the work, which the artist did say that while he was interested in iPhones and specifically apps as the mechanism for this work, that what really mattered was that it be a software-based work on a device that is similar to an iPhone. Now I will pass it on to Flaminia, but I will be back at the end to talk about our ongoing research.
Right. Okay, so this is the case study that I'm going to talk about is WYDRN, which is the acronym of What Are You Doing Right Now? So in 2017, MoMA hosted Project 106, which is a series of projects to bring also young artists to the exhibition to exhibit and display their work. And this was the first solo exhibition of Martine Sims. Within this context, she developed a multimedia installation that entailed and encompasses 3-channel feature-length digital film that you see in the center of this image, or just one section of it. 12 archival prints that you see on the back of the image and the background. And then steel benches, color window film that you see there in the corner, as well as also the purple of the wall that is quite a distinctive aspect of this work as well. And this exhibition was conceived as a collage across all these mediums and across multiple layers. When the exhibition closed, MoMA decided to acquire the whole exhibition. So let's look at one specific component of this work that is actually the augmented reality component. So basically, what are you doing right now? It is an augmented reality app that every visitor could download in the exhibition space. It was promptly available on the Apple Store, and every visitor could point the phone at the different archival prints, and through a facial recognition mechanism, augmented reality events would be triggered on your phone, and giving you like an additional layer of understanding of the work through a randomized flow of GIFs, images, videos, and audio. So Sims Studio explained this as an app that kind of fulfilled the need to create a bridge between different elements in this exhibition space. So in order to better understand the work, we sent a pre-acquisition questionnaire. At MoMA, the acquisition of works can be 1 year long, and they are very specific workflows depending on the work that is being acquired. But overall speaking, we generally send a pre-acquisition questionnaire that is drafted on the basis of the work that we are acquiring. So for this specific work, we asked a series of questions about how the work was made, so which development environment was created, which programming language was employed, if there was a control system being used, if there were any third-party technology dependence that we will need to be aware of, if there were any minimal requirements needed to run the app, and whether we were able to acquire the source code as part of the acquisition. So as we were having all this discussion, we are also starting a very important central dialogue with the artist, also to fulfill the moral responsibility of caring for these works. And often this dialogue starts with a pre-acquisition questionnaire, but it unfolds in other forms that are also, for example, physical interview with the studio, artist studio, the software developer, for example, and the artists themselves. And the first section was actually interviewing the software developer to understand what were the important semantics of this work, which tools were employed, and which significant features were considered important at the time of creation, and also agreeing on deliverables for the actual acquisition phase. So this is still what we call pre-acquisition phase. We are still gathering all important information to make sure that all the documents we are going to be sending between the gallery, the artist, and artist representative are all what we agreed upon. And so after this first interview, we were able to, first of all, identify, as Joy first mentioned earlier, that this is a native application, and the software that was utilized for actually creating this app, initially, when we were investigating this work and knowing that it was also based only on iOS devices, I thought that Xcode could have been utilized, but actually the software developer in the interview referred to a Wikitude program that was used, which is a proprietary software that at that time was offering a really interesting software development toolkit for augmented reality with a license that you have to buy every year. Basically, the Wikitude is a software that provides already created JavaScript, on top of which the software developer was able to add lines of code for the specifics of the augmented reality events that that's how they are called, programmed. And at that time was considered a really important aspect of those events, because some of them, when you hold your phone and you point the phone at those archival prints, you can also receive text messages. So the fast pace of texting, as if it's almost a real-time event, was a really important consideration. And MoMA would receive the source code, but not the Wikitude license, and neither the library. So as part of the documentation, I was starting to think about, how do we, can we capture the actual behavior on our phone of these events? And the first thing that I thought about, and this is something that we do, is not something very new in the field. When we do video documentation of software-based works, there is a screen recording that can be added to the manifold layers of documentation. And so for the specifics of the phone, I was able to look at customizing my control settings and add the screen recording to my phone. So I printed out all the archival prints, and then I recorded with the app downloaded on my phone what was the behavior. And so basically an example here is the randomized orders of images that come when you point it at the archival print. And it was also, I have to say, during this experiment, it was really important also to have a specific distance. As you heard at the beginning, there was this strange noise that's not part of the work, but sometimes in pointing the phone at the too close or maybe too distant, the event would not come up in real time. You will need to adjust your distance. So I then located different tapes on the floor to understand what was the best distance to actually have this triggering event. And then I did what I called not so much a condition assessment, but more of a content verification phase, which basically looked at the source code that we received with, as you can see here, these lines of code are actually the Wikitude parts of JavaScript that are already embedded, but we can't really look at how they are programmed. They are all these like already pre-made lines of code. And then in brackets, you can look at the assets that are being added to the code. So for example, for the first event, that we had the 2 MP4 file and 1 JPEG. And so I was doing almost like orchestration of looking at the source code, looking at each folder, and then recording on my phone what I was seeing. Basically as a way to ensure that what is actually programmed on the app that is available online is exactly what is programmed in the code and whether there were missing points. And indeed there were. After this condition assessment phase, we also had an interview with the artist over FaceTime, and we asked different questions about the making of the work, the making of the whole installation, because as I said earlier, we were acquiring the whole exhibition that was done. And one question that we addressed about the important qualities of the phone itself and whether what she considered significant, or whether she considered significant the aspect of time in the future to also migrate the work to other platforms that perhaps might not have the phone component. She replied as, it's a mark of the time. It's really gonna date it, it's gonna be so, even with the text, the way text bubbles look, or the sounds are so tied to the period of time. You look at the digital images from 5 years ago, you know it's from only 5 years ago. So in a way, in 10 years, that might become more a part of it. And I wanted to underline that those are considered young works. They are works that are made, they were made 2 years ago. We interviewed the artist 1 year after the acquisition, or in the process of the acquisition. So those ideas, for us are really important to have artists interview in a long phase of time to really capture the important qualities as the works unfold and as the technology develops alongside. And so this is a part of the documentation. I put together a report that takes into account and just slightly modify it a section of reading between the lines source code documentation as a preservation strategy for the conservation of software-based works. There was a collaboration between Dina Engel and Glenn Wharton. So I used this template that already exists in this article that is available online. I can share on the Google Doc. And I just modify it to the iOS-based application. And then at the bottom of this documentation, I also added a summary of the relationship between the actual archival print, because when we acquired the work, there was no bespoke, let's say, or transparent correlation between which archival prints trigger which events and what have we received, and do all archival prints have actually an event? That was also an important question, because we find out that not all archival prints have a correspondent augmented reality event. And then which assets we received in each, for each event. Okay, I'll pass over to Joy.
Yes, and I apologize, I realize we're going very long, so I'm going to go through this very quickly. So next slide, please. Yes. So a lot of this research we presented last year, so even since then, there's been a lot of updates, and you might be asking if we've been in touch with Apple about this, and the answer is yes. It will kind of probably come as no surprise that the case study or the use case of preserving iOS apps as artworks is something that very much eludes them. So I have not really made much headway in figuring out solutions with them. Next slide, please. So yes, I have attempted jailbreaking, which some of you might also be aware of. It's a way of kind of hacking some of the limitations that iPhones or Apple places on you to allow you to directly install apps and sidestep the developer account. However, these are very buggy since they're created by the kind of open source software development community. So they're pretty unstable, and I have yet to find a good version for iOS 11, which is what this work currently requires. And since now we're in the environment of iOS 12, which requires Xcode 11, we're now faced with a necessary migration from Swift 3 to Swift 4. However, and if you go to the next slide, please, we have found that while there were actually no differences between Swift 2 and Swift 3, there are significant ones from 3 to 4. So a number of the original behaviors of the work are no longer supported in Swift 4. And so this has further crystallized that, while we could go with this idea of upward mobility and constantly updating some of these works, we're now facing a sunsetting of some of these features. So that's led us to a number of conclusions. If you please go to the next slide, or next one even. So one is, looking to rebuild the work. And so there's been a lot of discussion recently about progressive web applications, and even Apple with iOS 11 kind of quietly jumped on to the possibility of being able to install apps as web-based and sidestepped the App Store. So that's really promising in that it wouldn't require a developer license anymore. However, there are a number of features in iOS that are not yet supported in progressive web applications, namely, unfortunately, for the Martin Sims work, the AR kit is not yet available, nor is Bluetooth or Face Touch ID. However, audio, front and rear camera, mapping, haptic features of touchscreen and sensors, those are all possible, but they rely on completely different programming languages. So Objective-C and Swift are no longer available. So for the Mungo Thompson work, at least, that would have to be entirely rebuilt. So next slide, please. But then lastly, we have other conclusions about how we could maintain the work as it was received. So it's really important to not just have the source code and the original device, but also the destination or the host computer that contains the version of Xcode and Swift and the OS, namely of the host computer that is being able to sign that to a device. So all of those really need to be frozen in time in order for an app that is signed through Xcode and through a developer account to continue to be done so on a yearly basis. But the artist interview is extremely fundamental to other strategies. Being able to actively check on the health of an app is going to be really important given that obsolescence cycles are so fast. But also budgeting for backup devices for testing, knowing that batteries, capacitors, all those things in mobile devices are extremely fragile as well. But the last thing we are really is kind of the main question mark is collaborations outside the field. So next slide, Flaminia, please. These could be questions that we start the discussion if we decide that there's time for that right now, but there may be other questions. But our questions are related to if our current software art strategies are adequate for app-based works, if things like PWAs, though there's still some movement to be made to capture all the same behaviors, if that's something to kind of hold our breath for. But also what kind of collaboration should we be making outside of museums and cultural heritage institutions that are dealing with preservation? Do we have to get really aggressive with the tech sector? These are questions that we've constantly been asking ourselves. So with that, I'll leave it there. I'm again sorry that we went very long, but I'm very anxious to hear if we have any questions.